And yeah, so here we are at Sydney University, 15th of June 2024, for an Australian General Semantics seminar. We have a tradition of these seminars every couple of months on Saturday mornings at this time. These days, in our post-COVID times, running just by Zoom because it's too difficult for people to get together. In fact, it was forbidden over the last few years for a while there. And we have some regulars here. David, of course, from the, there he is, from the south coast of New South Wales. Jean there, and myself, I'm Robert James. From Canberra. And some of us, yeah, we've come up from Canberra, and some of us have been general semanticists for many years. My father knew Laurie Cox during the war in the 40s, and Laurie's been in stalwart of general semantics, of course, all the rest of his adult life. But he died a few years ago, and I've sort of continued with him. And David, as we were saying, has come from New Zealand 9 years ago? 24 years ago, yeah, and been in GS also. Now, the important thing today, of course, is that we have Lance Strate from Fordham Uni, has had an arduous trip around the world to be with us today. Not just for us, actually. He's got some other speaking engagements here and at the Gold Coast. So Lance will be addressing us today on map, territory and environment. So it's not just a bipolar focus we have here today. So welcome, Lance. You can introduce yourself at more length. You're well known anyway in the GS community. You're most welcome today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you hear me, first of all?
I'll mute myself.
Sounds okay? These updates is that this version of Zoom that I'm using, I don't see the mute button anywhere. But as I was saying to folks here, back in the day, Neil Postman used to tell us to avoid technology whenever
yes.
possible. And
don't have children and animals in your group, or they get all the attention.
Yeah, well, and over he proves to be right, even though many of us haven't taken his advice. Yeah. But it's really great to be here in Sydney and to meet with you all. I wish more of you could be here in person, because that's there's no substitute. The old slogan in the US from the phone company was, next best thing to being there, but it's second best is far from best. But in any event, it is at the same time great to have the technology where we can interact in this way. So I thought maybe before we begin, if everyone could introduce themselves, because I know many of you, most of you know each other, but I don't know you folks all that much. So I'd love to hear who you are and your familiarity with general semantics.
Our host, Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Cheshire. I'm Senior Lecturer in Digital Cultures here at the University of Sydney. I'm relatively new to general semantics, in media ecology for a long time, but Lance introduced general semantics.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is David, and I've been involved in general semantics for about 47 years. Including going to about 5 GS conferences or training seminars in the States. And basically I'm the AGS event organiser. Thank you.
Jane, introduce yourself.
My name is Jean James. I'm the other half of Robert James. I've been involved with the GS as long as Robert's been involved with it. As a wife, we've travelled to America together, where Robert was given the special award, Award for his efforts in GS, and we're very involved with Laurie Cox, who was the founder of GS Australia. So we have had many trips to Sydney, about 40 trips overall, so backwards and forwards to Sydney and back, and so we know the road very well. So it's been quite an adventure, and it's great to be here now with Lance today. Thank you, Lance, for coming all the way to see us. Thank you.
Yes, I introduced myself a little bit before. Things and homely, and generally host the AGS meetings by Zoom these days from Canberra. We used to do it from Pauline and Gavin's home at Bonnet Bay, which is on the southern part of Canberra there. They graciously hosted our meetings, served lovely meals and so forth for many years. And we do thank Pauline and Gavin for that time. The apple cart was upset, of course, by the pandemic when we're not allowed to get together. So that's when we went online, and we've been that way ever since. That has the advantage, of course, of a global outreach, as long as you keep your technology organised and don't try and do anything different, which is what we're doing today. It has the disadvantage, of course, of, as Lance was saying, the absence of the personal presence. And people getting together geographically is really an important part of the human condition, and relates to issues of social ecology and media ecology and all these things that Lance lives with. So thank you, Pauline and Gav, for your long time in hosting GS meetings personally.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I've been going to GS since 1989, and Gavin and I met, and eventually after many years got married. And my son Andrew, who sadly died a few weeks ago, was an enthusiastic participant, especially when Milton came over in 2002, and he actually spoke to GS about his understanding of the structural differential, and made a good friend with Milton, and he's Gavin.
Okay. I can't talk at the moment.
Yeah, so next.
Hi. I think you can hear me, hopefully. Hi, my name is Jason Tremaine. I've participated in General Semantics for over 5 years now. I've got to present at the ACML twice, once online, once in person in New York. Really enjoyed that. And during the pandemic, I found AGS online, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, by the way. And yeah, during the pandemic, I found AGS online, and they were open to let me be part of their group and be active with the group. Earlier this year, I got to present for the group. Aligning the map with the territory was the topic. So yeah, and I've been reading the book Science of Sanity. Give out a plug. Really good book.
There you go.
It is a bit of a struggle, Jason. The language is quite difficult.
My name is Stuart Hill. I'm an emeritus professor and foundation chair of social ecology. While I was at McGill University, where I was for nearly 30 years, I met Rachel Lauer, who was from New York and very active in general semantics. And she wrote a book, which unfortunately she sadly died, and was hoping, her student was hoping that I was going to edit it and publish it. I was in the process of moving from Canada to Australia, so I never got to publish it, and the student never got to publish it. So it's tragically still remains as an unpublished, outstanding piece of writing, which I hope one of you will pick it up. Oh, now I can't hear him. I can't hear Lance.
As a point of reference, Stuart, maybe down in the bottom left corner, you might have accidentally muted your microphone.
Okay.
And can you hear me now through this mic?
Yes. I guess I can go. So I just joined this group a few days ago. I just learned about the actual term general semantics just now with GPT. Forgive my ignorance. Trying to define whether it's I'd say the difference between mapping. It seems like general semantics is either hyper focused on, I guess, as a core goal, distinguishing between reality phenomenologically, or distinguishing between reality and language, which it seems like general semantics is more concerned with the difference between the reality that exists and the reality that manifests through words. If anyone wants to clarify that, that'd be appreciated. But me, like I said, I just joined. I roughly inferred what general semantics would be roughly about. And what else? I'm based in Sydney. I can say in closing, I suffered a traumatic brain injury about a decade ago. And I'm on the quest to get a lot smarter. In the last couple of years, my cognition has radically improved. I'm trying to grab as many IQ points specific to fluid intelligence and communication as I can, and general semantics looks like a good place to begin.
Well, Ben, I can say that general semantics is an excellent place to begin in terms of raising your practical problem-solving ability and maybe your IQ.
Yeah, IQ roughly. I lean more towards fluid intellect. I appreciate that as well. As a point of interest, it seems like there's a lot of corollary with the concept of metacognition and being aware of one's mental models. And I've only been in the meetup groups for approximately 2 months, but in that time, I've been in a few groups, and I'm going to start my own metacognitive group soon. So general semantics, especially with its awareness of the way we're processing information, seems ideal.
Yes, we're very much into meta maps.
I'm sorry?
We're into meta maps, mapping the map.
Meta maps, yeah.
Yeah. Talking about the accuracy of the map, how accurate it can be, problems you have with mapping, problems you have with language. There's quite a few traps, like for instance, either or distortion. So, someone else want to do a talk, an intro?
I will. Hi, everyone. I'm Renee. I'm a PhD candidate in my final year. And I'm also a journalist in radio and television. I've worked in the industry for 20 years. How I connected with Professor Lance was I introduced media ecology into my PhD, which is a creative practice-based PhD. So that's part thesis and part podcast, a 5-episode series. And I went to the library and found the book on media ecology and went, oh, Lance Strate, right. How do I find him? So I went to LinkedIn and connected with Lance. Thanks to Lance, I'm lucky enough to be here with General Semantics. I've also presented my research at some of the amazing symposiums that Lance has organised online. And then obviously being connected via David on email with their emails. So it's really great to see you all. I will be at ICA on the panel with Lance. So it's nice to have Lance in Australia. And obviously, I guess I'm the novice here in the conversation today, but I'm very honoured to listen and learn. And looking forward to the journey with General Semantics in Australia and in the US.
Now, it's important that we get Lance vocal here.
I think.
Could you mute yourself and speak through this mic?
Well, I think my mic is working now.
Okay, so we'll.
Yeah.
End up mute myself on this complication. See how you go.
Yeah, but I think we have a few more people to introduce.
Yeah, let's continue.
I'll have a go if you like. I've been involved in general semantics for about 30 years, and I'm part of the Laurie Cox brood, little chickadees who've gone into the future with the practices in hand. And I do some research at Wollongong University in psychophysiology. Thank you.
I think Tom's still has to go.
Me?
Yes. Tom, could you say something about yourself?
Sure. I am a copywriter, freelance copywriter and journalist based in Melbourne. I started with General Semantics, I think, just before when I was an undergrad in uni. And then I did postgrad in media communications. And I did a paper called, it's actually a real mouthful, An iPhone in Every Hand. I wrote this, I should know this. Communication Structures, the Global Village and something, which was published in Etc. I think in 2011. And I think Dr. Strate and I had a little bit of a back and forth with that. I also presented at the one and only national conference that we had here, and I believe it was 2010. Correct me if I'm wrong. And basically sort of been dipping in and out ever since with the general semantics stuff. Always reading about it, always cognizant of it, and as I guess a mental discipline, and as a formulation to sort of navigate through life and reality and that kind of thing. So try to make time for it when I can. So yeah, that's me.
Well, great. I think that's everyone. So, okay, we're good. It's great to meet you all, both in person and as was mentioned, I had a bit of travail getting here on time, but it was really a very high priority for me to be able to meet with the AGS, given my role as president of the Institute of General Semantics. So, and first of all, I want to encourage you all to be members of the IGS if you're not already. It certainly is great to know that there is an active and vibrant Australian society. and it's almost a misnomer to call it one of our local societies, in the same sense that we have a New York Society for General Semantics, which has been very active for some time. But there is a great tradition, and I think we all know that general semantics had its heyday in the mid-20th century and then kind of faded. And I think there were like maybe hundreds of local societies all over the world. I think part of the fade had to do with the revelation that Hayakawa was a bit of a right-wing kook in some ways. But in any event, I think that we're certainly due for a revival and a renewal and a reorientation as well. I know the societies, though, go back to the Society for General Semantics, which became the International Society, which was also my way into it, or my first, if you like, allegiance, which is more eclectic, more open-ended than the Institute was, at least in most of its history, where you got kind of more of the orthodox Korzybskian approach as opposed to the kind of looser Hayakawa approach. And I know that this was a point of contention for a long time, but some time ago, the two organizations merged, and I think that we're closer to the society view that we share than the older orthodox view in terms of looking at general. We want to look at general semantics as something organic and evolving, and not just a kind of fixed camp that has to be followed in an absolute sense. I will say that my introduction to general semantics came in my first semester undergraduate in an introduction to communication theory class, along with many of the ideas associated with media ecology, including Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis, Jacques Ellul, Daniel Boorstin. Also, some key ideas like general systems theory, as it was referred to, or just the systems view. What we would call relational communication, if you're familiar with Paul Watzlawick and those kind of folks, and a lot of great ideas that I immediately latched onto, and then followed up with in an advanced course as an undergraduate, and then after doing a master's, starting my PhD with Neil Postman in the old media ecology program. It was great to learn that general semantics was part of that as well, and part of the overall media ecology curriculum. Years ago in the 70s, when Postman was involved in general semantics, he tried to argue that media ecology is general semantics writ large. Not quite accurate, but it is an important foundation for media ecology, and one we try to communicate, because a lot of the folks who are just, say, into McLuhan, for example, especially the folks from Canada, as opposed to us New Yorkers. The New Yorkers who came through Postman are familiar with general semantics. The Toronto folks who were just like McLuhan and Harold Innis, they tend to not be familiar with it. So we try to explain to them the significance of the general semantics approach, and how valuable it is. Just to give you some orientation about where I'm coming from, and other folks that are now very much involved in the Institute. I do want to say, just along with encouraging you to be members of the Institute, and especially to the leadership, and thank you to James and David. I want to say that let us know what we can do for you. Right, the Institute, one of our missions is to support all of these efforts, including our, again, I use this, local organizations. So whatever we can do. And I will say that if my luggage had been here, I did bring several copies of the new edition of Science and Sanity to give to you folks. If it gets here by Monday, then I'll bring it to the talks for you folks to have. You said you have a library here. Yeah, yeah. Well, if one of you are here or can pick it up from Chris, at a later time.
Well, we can do that. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Yeah, we have a substantial printed collection.
Yeah, but if there's other,
Here in Canberra, yeah.
yeah, if there are other books that we're coming out with that, let me know, and we're glad to help you. And and it's also, Stuart, I don't know if you saw what I put in the comments when you couldn't hear me, but I certainly know the name of Rachel Lauer, and would love to be able to publish the book. We do that, and of course we encourage, as some of you know, publication in etc. And glad to have you come involved in our events. We have our annual Korzybski Lecture and Symposium, as Jason knows, and now we do it at this wonderful place called The Players in New York City. And we also do an online symposium. We've done that for the past 3 years, via Zoom. So again, love to have your involvement, and maybe even have like a major event here at some time in the future. So we're here to support you. I just want to make that very clear. And when I was emailing with David about meeting with the Australian Society, and I could give a talk, and gave me about a dozen or more different things to talk about, and which proved kind of impossible. But I thought that I would just touch on a few different things in the time that we have, and rather than give one coherent talk, because why be coherent? This is general semantics. I'm just kidding, of course, but I do teach a class for undergraduates that is largely on general semantics. It's called Language, Consciousness, and Culture, and about 2/3 of it has to do with general semantics. So I thought I would just throw out some of the things that I do with that class, and maybe end with some other things. We'll see how time works out here. I don't know if we can go past 12, if that's okay. Sure. Till 1 o'clock. Okay, so I'm fine with that. I mean, I could go all day on this stuff. Well, okay. And so I guess I'll start with, one of the first things that, I find very relevant to talk about is the connection to science. And I think some of that has maybe been lost over the years. It's just sort of interesting that when you look at the history of general semantics, that so many of the people involved in, say, mid-20th century were scientists. And then one of the problems for today is the fact that, when we read, like, say, Wendell Johnson, for example, or Korzybski, all those folks took for granted that everyone accepts the legitimacy of science, and knows that the scientific approach is the correct one, and, we've reached this weird point in reality where, in culture, where there is this incredible denialism. And maybe there was back then too. I mean, there were still folks who weren't accepting evolution back then. Yeah. Well, I think that COVID really brought it to a head. But even before that, the denial of climate change. And I think that one of the important things that I certainly stress, I don't want to actually impose on you and tell you what you should be doing. And I always hate that, people do that organizationally. And just last week we had our annual Media Ecology Association convention. And when we had our business meeting, there were people who chime in who say, you guys should be doing this. And I said, okay, how do you want to do it? And they say, oh, well, it's for you to do. So everyone's great with talking and making suggestions. So I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to say that for myself, I find that stressing the importance of science is very significant, and understanding science, which also means not accepting it as an absolute authority, but being familiar with scientific method, with empiricism, with an understanding of what a fact is. And a fellow I follow on Facebook, and I had some very limited interaction with him previously, David Brin. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's actually a scientist, but best known as a science fiction writer. Of course, General Semantics has a long connection to science fiction. I actually do another course on science fiction, film, and TV. One of the films I like to show is Alphaville. Anyone know that film? Jean-Luc Godard. They go to the Institute of General Semantics, a fictional IGS located in Alphaville, which is of Paris, and it's portrayed in a negative light because it houses the computer Alpha, which controls everyone in Alphaville. But it connects to the fact that a lot of science fiction writers in mid-20th century, Heinlein, Frank Herbert, who worked with Hayakawa, von Vogt, and Philip K. Dick, through what's his name, Robert Anton Wilson, that they were familiar with general semantics. But David Brin is probably best known for the novel The Postman, which was made into a Kevin Costner movie. But anyway, I mean, he's been arguing about the right wing in the US as being against all of the fact-based professions, right? That includes science, but also law, arguing against the legitimacy of the judicial system, and also the military. You can't have a military that's grounded in fantasy, right? Facts are unavoidable.
Engineering industry without
Absolutely.
respect for facts.
Yeah. So I think and also, I mean, we're just doing, I mean, when I say we, I'm not doing it, but Corey Anton, who's the vice president of the IGS, and Tom Gencarelli, who's the editor of Etc. They just did a first of 2 special issues on politics. But one of the things that we also need to keep in mind, if we're assuming we're all pro-democracy, I hope we are, is the fact that modern science and democracy came about in tandem, and they're both products of the Enlightenment, and they're both supported by in the same way, by this understanding of facts. So I think these things have a powerful connection to one of the major concerns that we're dealing with in the present day. So I think part of what I try to get across then is teaching about scientific method, as general semantics is sort of scientific method writ large, applied to everyday life and politics and and human relations. And that means paying attention to the facts and not putting theory or ideology or theology before facts, and adjusting your views as new facts come to light. And yes, absolutely. And so understanding that our knowledge is always limited. Things are always always in need of correction, of course, but that we can get a handle on things. That's where, and that connects to the idea of the non-Aristotelian. I have a lot of people, being an academic, there are a lot of people who come to us, and they're interested, but coming from philosophy. And they're like, what's wrong with Aristotle? And it's like nothing, Aristotle's great. Korzybski loved Aristotle. Aristotle was one of the 100 people that he lists, he dedicates science and sanity to. The problem with Aristotle is not being willing with the system. Mainly the issue is logic, Aristotelian logic, which is all about static relationships, identity relationships, and not acknowledging change or empirical facts. Bertrand Russell said that Aristotle wrote that men have more teeth than women, and even though he was married, it never occurred to him to actually count. And, you know,
The question of ribs, how many ribs do we have?
all of that, right? And, you know, that's where, you know, we have to check things out. And, you know, and for Aristotle, everything is sort of in its place and not movable. So species are eternal. Darwin blows that away. Even Lamarck before that. And Gregory Bateson makes the point that Lamarck was right about evolution. He was just wrong about inherited traits, although now we find that he was mostly wrong, but there is some room for that. But that's change, you know, and that's where of course, Korzybski came to this non-Aristotelian with the model of non-Newtonian physics from Einstein, that there is no absolutes, there are no absolutes, and non-Euclidean geometry. So non-Aristotelian is to acknowledge that everything is always changing. Everything is always in flux. And this is so much a part of early 20th century. When you look at modern art, that's what it was about. Picasso's big shift was to acknowledge time, change over time, and try to incorporate that into his artwork, rather than, you know, when you look at perspective in art, it's all about the frozen moment. That's the only way to capture it.
Well, we thought that art might become obsolete when photography was invented, didn't we?
Well, yeah, well, it certainly had an effect on art, but the effect was to free up, to move away from what we would call today photorealistic graphics. And it is amazing, you know, to think that at the time of the Renaissance, when that art was introduced, people would look at a painting of a bowl of fruit and actually feel like they could reach out and touch it. They were so amazed. Just like when the motion picture was introduced, and there were reports that, you know, some of the early exhibitions of projected images was of they were called actualities in French, but like just real scenes. And one was of a train pulling into a station, and people like jumped out, and and we look at that and they say, how could people think that? But we're always reorienting ourselves, reconfiguring ourselves. But so it's just to take that into account, that constant flux of things, but also to understand, and we say the map is not the territory, the word is not the thing, the menu is not the meal. That's one Gregory Bateson liked. That this is not to get to the other extreme in deconstruction, post-structuralism, the other extreme that everything is a complete construction and there is no objective reality. The scientific part is to say that there is something out there, and there are good maps and bad maps. And a map is all about getting to its utility. Well, it's first about accuracy. Is it accurate or not? How close does it get to things? And can it get us to where we need to go? So it's not to reach the absolute denial of knowing anything about the world, but to understand that there are better and worse assessments of what's out there, and let's improve our assessments. That's the essence of general semantics. So that's where I guess the first thing. Let me cue this up. So Korzybski's finding was that when we talk about maps, the key element is structure, and there are, it's a problem of structural similarity. In a later time, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure how well versed they were, but if you're familiar with systems theory, there were two major folks. They were Chilean biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, they coined the term autopoiesis, which is about the ability of systems to organize themselves, which explains the origin of life. Because evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. It only explains what happens after life begins. But autopoiesis is the idea of a system creating itself, the parts coming together to form the system. They did a wonderful book called The Tree of Knowledge, where they refer to structural coupling. That is, in a sense, the inner map that we develop and the outer map the outer territory of the world out there. And there has to be a structural coupling. The inner map has to reflect in some way the outer reality in order for us to survive. Right. And, it doesn't make sense otherwise, unless you go to the extreme of solipsism, with the idea that we're all just like lying on a slab somewhere with electrodes in our brain or just dreaming this whole thing. Yeah. Yeah. We're in the matrix and, maybe we are, but if we are, what do you got, what's the point of imagining we are? We have to function. So, it is to understand that maps can be better or worse, but that maps that, we need to think about it. So one of the things I like to do is to just go literally to the question of mapping the territory and look at some different maps, the idea of that, how we represent the territory. So let me do a share screen now. And okay. I don't know. I don't know why this isn't okay. So
Really with that, is that P, how do you spell that? Oh,
okay. I'm not able to see which, actually, I gotta take care of something first. Okay. Now I should be able to go back to, okay. Okay, share this. All right, I have to quit Zoom and restart it. I'm sorry, I can't share the screen. I didn't realize I had to do this. So
shouldn't have to do that.
it's a new computer and it wants me to do it. So I'll just be right back.
Yeah.
Can always blame it on jet lag.
All righty. Okay, let's try.
Yeah, we need to say is
Okay, is the microphone working still? You hear me? Okay, just waiting to get the permission and okay. There,
Here we go, mapping the territory.
yeah, and
There's 5.
okay,
We had an exciting time. Chris coming into this building at level 3.
okay, so you're all seeing this now?
Yeah, we are.
And you're hearing me?
And you,
Okay, and this was actually from maybe some of the old timers will remember Glimpse, which was a newsletter from the old International Society. And I believe Australia has a similar kind of map, which and I like to ask the students what's wrong with the map, and hope to get the answer it's upside down. And so to ask, well, why is it upside down? That and I actually try to be a little playful or try to say, well, when you go north, you're walking up the planet, aren't you?
Defining your frame of reference, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, and of course, when they take pictures of the Earth from space, they always show the northern hemisphere is up, so that's up, right? And try to get them, and it's amazing how few people really get the fact that there is no up or down in space. There is nothing like that, and so it's completely arbitrary. And I say, well, why do you think we put north on top?
Well, when I came to Manhattan the first time,
Yeah.
in my very wonderful presentation, I showed a satellite picture of the world that proved that Australia was the centre of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Because of those all around,
Yeah.
It's obviously the centre of the world.
But there is a reason why you orient it in the direction you do, because east and west are real things because of the rotation of the Earth.
Yes.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that east and west are, I mean, you could say with the rotation or against the rotation, but east and west themselves are arbitrary designations, as are north and south. Yeah. Yeah. So of course, the obvious answer is that, well, the map makers, going back to Mercator, they were all from the north, all from Europe to begin with, and they created, so they naturally put it that way, created maps that put north on top. Although I also like to point out, and what do you think was before this time, because this really goes back to Gutenberg, the printing press. That's where these maps started, which coincide almost exactly. I mean, Gutenberg first printed books, or circa 1450, and then we get Columbus 1492. So, but and in that sense, I mean, what made a bigger difference in the lives of the everyday European? It was the printing press, not the discovery of the New World. But what do you think they put on top before they put north on top? When they made, older maps.
Picture of a whale or something.
Well, what's the word we use to say to get your bearings or to find your direction? Orientation. The Orient, right? That it was the East. Why? Not because of the Earth's rotation. Who knew about that? Sunrise. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it, that's the top of the world.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and we still use that word to orient ourselves, even where, referring to using orient in its to refer to people now is considered not politically correct. But just, to see that, I mean, that's an embedded metaphor. That's a metaphor where we forget, we say orientation. And we don't even think east. So It is kind of interesting. This is a little bit different, but I'll just bring it up because I do throw media ecology in to these things. And the older, this idea of the map and also is and something that McLuhan and others called visual space, because it puts ourselves outside of the world, looking at the world in this sort of alienated, distanced, objective visual view. And when you think about older ideas like the pirate map, which was like, really, they were just directions, like, walk 5 paces to the big rock, right, and then turn left. And they put you inside the space, which is what McLuhan called acoustic space, McLuhan and others, because when you listen at the center of everything, and everything is around you, as opposed to looking as if you were outside of the world. And when you look at, one of his arguments was that with electronic media, we're back in acoustic space because we're taking everything in wherever we are through our electronic devices. You think about GPS, that puts you back inside the world, because GPS, they may put up a little map, but most of GPS is telling you where to go while you're inside of it. But anyway, to get back to other maps now, okay, this is one, this goes back to the Cold War era, but I thought it was very interesting. I think it was back in the late 70s when Jimmy Carter was president and Zbigniew Brzezinski was the defense secretary. But and it was a piece from U.S. News and World Report that I had kept, where he was trying to show, when we look at the map in its standard orientation, the Soviet Union and sort of Northern Europe, we don't get as good a sense of the threatening way, and this actually speaks to our current moment now, but here's the Soviet Union and like how important Poland looks from this orientation, that Poland is the buffer zone between Russia, the Soviets in this case, and Western Europe. Yeah. And he was actually in that article, he explains how in the military, they look at things from all different angles. And they don't just look at the standard maps. One of the things, and the Canadians were very aware of this, where, in the US we weren't, was that Canada is the buffer zone between the US and Russia. With the ICBMs would be coming over the North Pole in between the two. So again, it's just to think about map and territory relations and how we need to look at things from different angles. So, and here I put up the polar view, which shows that relationship. That we think of, again, the US and Russia as being like on opposite ends of the world. And in fact, again, we are sort of face each other with Canada in between over the Arctic. And now that we're melting the ice caps, that becomes especially significant. Of course, this polar view was the basis of the United Nations flag, which is also kind of privileges the northern space. And look what happened to poor Australia here. It got squished, but then, and it's a little not visible from there, but there's also a southern version of it that I have over here that distorts the north. It's, and part of the point is that whatever map we use, something gets distorted and things get left out. That's part of the argument. Now, here's an old school Mercator projection, although it also includes Antarctica here. But, this is included and one of the interesting things that is helpful here, look at the size of Greenland, for example, because what this projection does, when you think about, we're taking this much smaller surface of the pole, the north and south parts, and stretching them out. in order to accomplish this. And also each square, each rectangle represents the same amount of territory, but we see where Africa, they're small squares, and we get to the north, and then they're enlarged as rectangles. And this is how the traditional Mercator projection really distorted the world, makes Europe seem much larger than it is, and Africa much smaller than it is. You know, that Africa is, in fact, enormous. So this is sort of interesting, which tries to show the true size of countries compared to the Mercator projection, and how off some of these things can be. So again, but let me show. This comes from Buckminster Fuller, who was someone who was considered a futurist in his time, and he created the geodesic dome. But he also tried to create a more accurate map, because again, we're taking a three-dimensional surface and trying to flatten it out. So how do we do that? Fuller also had, and I'm blanking on it now, but he was actually famous for telling physics students, I think at Columbia University, that you're all like live in the medieval world because you still refer to sunrise and sunset. And he had something, he had new words for them, like sun clips, to try to capture the fact that it's not the sun that's moving, it's the earth that's moving. But here he created, and this is tries to show the accurate size of everything. Although what you lose are, again, the geographical relationships by pulling things out in that way. This one was created by some folks in Japan based on Fuller's design. It won an award a few years ago for a new map design that provides an accurate, a more accurate understanding of the relative size of the continents. So here we see that Africa is almost as large as Asia, and of course Europe is tiny in comparison. And of course, the most accurate thing would be the globe, but then we lose the ability to see it all at once when we get to a globe. So that in itself is, whatever we do, we can never, this is the general semantics principle of non-allness. We can't get it all. We can never represent all there is to represent about the world. And even then, it's hard to get at what do you privilege in your map? Do you privilege political boundaries? Do you try to go for geographical elements? It's hard to get, elevation properly represented. There's just so much. We always have to make choices. And again, it's not to say that you can't be accurate in some ways, but something has to give. This one was sort of interesting. It came up, some of you were mentioning Hurricane Sandy, but this was, I think, the other hurricane, I forget which one, but the point was this is the U.S. state of Louisiana, and someone came up with how the state still represents itself, but how do you represent swampland? And an area that's pretty much underwater at this point, and a more accurate map would look like this one on the right. I know it's partially blocked off maybe, but the fact again gets to territories are changing. They're constantly changing. But our maps don't represent that change.
Some time ago, New Zealand had a bit of a tectonic movement and tilted a bit differently.
Really?
Tilted down on the western side, I think, a few inches, whatever. And people are saying, oh, maybe the airfare will be reduced now because it's
We've got a new band up on the east side of the South Island of Kaikoura. The CB came up.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what we think is absolute, and that's not ain't necessarily absolute.
Yeah. So now, let me actually. I also, want to, all right, let me, so go back to Zoom. Okay, I also want to get to the idea of, well, like to use some examples from astronomy. So let me see, this is, got to get past stupid YouTube's, sorry. There we go. Okay. Do we have the sound playing? Is it playing on that? I don't hear it coming. Chris, well, I actually, we can let this go because I can just share you can hear me, right? And it is showing Chris, we need the sound play the sound on this. What he's talking about though is,
but rather spheroids scattered in space, always in motion, not.
But the question was, which of the planets is closest to the Earth? And that when we usually represent the solar system, we do it in this way where the planets are all lined up. And so, at its closest, Venus is closest to the Earth, and then Mars comes in second. Do we have sound yet? And this actually tries to answer, you can't just say which of the planets is closest because they're moving and they're circling around. Now, this comes up with when we want to send like a probe to Mars, we have to wait or travel there eventually. We have to wait till they're in line. But so this tries to answer which planet is closest.
But in ellipses at untidy angles, in the cold, dark expanse. This
Is it
the
playing?
coziest Venus gets to Earth, but only about once a year and a half-ish. Starting close, she orbits far, then comes back, needs some space on the other side of the sun. This means when Venus is away, Mars can be the closest to play. So because of orbits, there isn't one answer to who is the closest. It's really who is mostly the closest. The mostest closest. When Mars and Venus are both on the other side of the sun, it leaves little degree. Each of Earth's inner three planet friends are, at one time, the farthest and the closest. And Mercury, with his smallest orbit, makes him never that far from Earth, at least on planetary scales, giving the little guy a uniquely close relationship with Terra. In fact, watching the planets spin, because of his small orbit,
Well, I'm gonna.
not Mars or Venus, is the closest planet most of the time. Looking at the line, that seems impossible, but nonetheless, in the way of actual orbits, if we keep measuring the distance to all the planets as they spin, Mercury is Earth's mostest closest neighbor.
I'm just going to stop for a minute. Up share.
Should say.
It is. It's going to stay down home and back to the station 7 is not
share screen sound is not going to come through the speakers. It's connected to your computer.
We have that problem with the reverb.
Which is delightfully unexpected. But wait, Mercury is the mostest closest.
Coming through now. Are you getting the sound?
Well, right? Because her orbit is smaller than Earth, and running the numbers is true, making Earth's special relationship with Mercury less special. But at least this is one time where the line provides the obvious answer. Mercury is closest to Venus. While we're here, who is Mars's mostest closest? On his other side is the asteroid belt, so it should be Earth, but maybe it's Venus. Maybe the rule is the second closest is the mostest closest. Watching the results and oh my Celestia, it's Mercury again. Mercury is the most closest to Earth, Venus, and Mars for the same reason each time. Bigger orbits make farther average distances for longer times. So mercurial Mercury is the constantest companion. No, it can't be true for Jupiter too. Or Miss or Jupiter. But it is. Once again, Mercury's small orbit means it never goes as far away as the other planets with their bigger orbits. Thus, are you ready for this? The orbital math that shows Mercury is the mostest closest to Jupiter is the same for all the planets and everything that orbits the sun. You too, Pluto. For each of the planets, Mercury is the mostest closest.
Hey.
An example of dating, isn't it?
So what's interesting about that is the fact that when you take into account the dynamic relationship of the planets.
Hello, Internet. In my last video about Pluto, you may have noticed that I said aloud the names of every planet except one, this one. And that was no accident, but rather the...
Okay.
Switch to Chrome to load your favorite.
Now I want to show another video here. And that gets at the true nature of the solar system. And I think this one is particularly mind-blowing. So this is, yeah, okay. Share.
Sites fast, so you can browse with ease.
Well, all of the Milky Way is moving.
Not exactly the sky. See the planets. And the sun seems to have developed a tunnel.
Yeah, the idea is it's moving and it's pulling everything with it. Doesn't really. This is what Gregory Bateson called meta patterns. Mhm. Yeah.
It's easier than ever to make a custom.
So, I mean, I think that's great because it does show the dynamic, relationship and the fact that we represent things in such a static way. It's also really freaky, right? I mean, just to think about how everything is in motion and, I mean, when you talk about Spaceship Earth, which was Buckminster Fuller's coinage, and that fragility of that little blue marble, especially when we had the photo taken from the moon that, or that finally showed it, yeah, but also just the image of the little Earth taken from far, far away and just that sense of fragility. But then when you think about the fact that we're just like zooming through through the galaxy, the whole galaxy spinning. I mean, just that whole idea, gets at how inaccurate, in a sense, our mapping is. But of course, we have to do that in order to just get a handle on things. So, and I don't want to like do too much of this because we don't have forever, but over the course of a semester when I do those, there's like a third one. I can share the link at some time, but there's a third video I show that actually does try to get at a scale model of the solar system. It's actually pretty incredible, and it's a video that won an award just for filmmaking, but it shows these guys going out to the southwest of the US and creating, in the desert, like creating a scale model where the Earth is about this size. And they really like are driving around to get the proper proportions of all the planets. So just trying to understand these things. And I also I when we're talking about the map and the territory and so much of the identification of general semantics has to do with language, but a lot of it is also about perception when we go back again to Korzybski. And so I also do a whole thing on perception and, some of the fun things about optical illusions, but, with that idea that we don't see things as they are. And really early on, I mean, Korzybski was well aware of that what the way perception works is that you have sensitive tissues that are irritated and fire off signals and which are then reach the brain where things are processed, and somehow we create this sense of what's out there. I don't like to think about this too much because it's freaky to think that what we're seeing is not what's really there, and that somehow we've created it, and it's like no. That we have to stop at some point because, but that understanding perception and how the sensory perception actually works is very much a part of things as well. I don't know if you folks have heard of Adelbert Ames. You, yeah, and that, you know, and that goes back to earlier 20th century, and he was one of the, you know, folks kind of bringing this to the fore. And I thought maybe, did I?
Strange twisted room, is it that you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he's famous for the Ames room,
Yeah.
which is trapezoidal rather than square or rectangular, right? It doesn't have the right angles. So people standing at two different ends, when you're looking at it straight on, it looks like one person's tiny and one person's gigantic. And we, even knowing that, we can't stop, which, by the way, only affects people in our kind of culture, because we live in a world of straight lines and right angles. Yeah. So we've learned to, our perception is trained in that way. Folks in like tribal cultures don't have that illusion, because they're not used to that sort of rectilinear kind of framing. Yeah, yeah.
Strange buildings here now.
Yes, we've really moved away. Again, throwing in some media ecology, the rectilinear idea comes from literacy, or comes from writing. Denise Schmant-Besserat, who's an archaeologist, pointed this out, that you look at prehistoric artwork, and pictures are just sort of willy-nilly. And once writing was invented, writing takes characters and puts them in a line. You start to think in terms of lines, and the pictures, people started to line up the pictures as well. And in architecture, people start to line up buildings or houses in a line. So you really, and that's where we start to put everything. You look around our world, everything is straight lines and right angles. And so, you know, it follows this sort of argument that when we reach this sort of new electronic era, we start to move away from straight lines and right angles. And some of that architecture is sort of disturbing. If yeah, well, we have it too. It's everywhere. Yeah, the postmodern kind of impulse.
Just so there's a message here from Tom in Melbourne,
Oh,
who says there's a solar system scale model walk in Melbourne, and he's got the link for it.
yeah,
We'll put that into the record here.
great.
To access it.
Great, yeah. Well, so let me just share a video that's similar to it, and you know, I show it to my class, and of course the foreign accent can be a little off-putting for some folks, but I think you'll.
As long as I speak the Queen's English properly.
Yeah.
Understand it.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you'll be fine with it. Okay, share. The sound coming through? No sound?
Brain is more remarkable.
Let's wait for Chris to get the sound back. Or was it me?
And it was, yeah, Lance, it is, you can hear it just like it was waiting for the introduction. So.
Well, maybe I just stopped the share. Let me retry it. Yeah, I forgot to click the share sound.
Than the most powerful computer in the world.
Is it coming through?
To trick that very brain of yours. Have a look at this. What can you see? Oh, you say that's easy. I can see a window going around. Is it rotating? Oh, no, it paused. Now it's going the other way. Okay, so we're watching a window that's going backwards and forwards. Pauses again. Now it goes back the other way. Backwards and forwards all the time, oscillating.
You can hear
You
the
sure that's
sound.
what you're seeing? In fact, you're looking at an optical illusion that was invented by Adelbert Ames back in 1951, and it's quite a remarkable illusion. If we stop the window now, you notice that it was rotating the same direction all the time on a turntable, same way all the time, but it isn't a rectangle. You assumed that it was a window, so it must be a rectangle. Oh, no, it isn't. Look at that end there, quite short. This end, quite large. In fact, it's a trapezoid, a strange shape, not a rectangle though. But because we've seen so many windows in our lives, we assume that they're all rectangular. Let's have a look at a real window. Your brain was forced to make a choice in that illusion between seeing a rectangular window going backwards and forwards or a trapezoid rotating, and you chose the rectangular window. You knew that whenever you look at a rectangular window that has cross pieces, you can see not only the fronts of those cross pieces, but also the sides. You may even see shadows underneath some of the cross pieces. But you've seen so many of these windows that you know all the time they'll be rectangular. And you can see that I've painted this window on a flat piece of cardboard to look like a real window. In fact, I've painted the cross pieces so that they appear to be three-dimensional. I've even painted in the shadows that you might get if you had a light from above. Okay, now you know it's an illusion. You know it's not a window, it's a flat piece of cardboard. You also know that it's a trapezoid, it's not a rectangle. So now the illusion won't work with you, will it? Or will it? Have a look at it again. Well, this really is quite crazy, isn't it? We know all about the illusion now. It shouldn't work on us, and yet it still does. We still see the window going backwards and forwards. Look at that. It's appearing to pause now, and now change direction and go back the other way. Even though we know, because we've seen it on the turntable, we know that it's rotating in the same direction all the time. Well, I think the problem is we don't have a reference point. What we need to do is to attach something to the window. So we'll stop it now and attach a matchbox to one end. We'll attach it to the short end here with a paper clip. And then all you need to do is to watch that matchbox and use that as your point of reference. So this time the illusion won't trick you, or will it? Watch this. There's the matchbox going around the back of the window. Keep watching it. Now look what happens. The window appears to pause and go backwards, but the matchbox keeps coming and floats out past this edge of the window and rejoins the other edge of the window. Watch it again. Goes around the back. Firmly attached to the window, you can see that. But here's the crazy part. The window appears to stop, to pause, and then go backwards, but the matchbox just keeps on coming, floating through space. I think maybe the problem is we have our reference point attached to the window. Let's stop it. Take the matchbox off, and this time put on a reference point through the center of the window. What I'll use is a ruler, wooden ruler, can't bend, and I'll attach it right to the center of the window in this position here. Now this time you watch the ruler. You know it can't bend. So this time I'm sure we will defeat the illusion. What do you think? Here we go. Now there's the window rotating. So is the ruler. It's attached to the window. But what's happening here? The window's going backwards, the ruler's still coming, and now it goes somehow or other through the window itself. Really crazy. Window pauses again, ruler keeps coming. Ruler's attached to the window, you can see that. You can even see the pin. Watch what happens here. Ruler's coming, window pauses, window goes backwards, and somehow or other they go through each other, even though you know they can't do it. What a crazy illusion Adelbert Ames invented. Isn't that remarkable? You know, you can make one yourself simply with a piece of cardboard, small piece of cardboard, which you'll paint to give that same sort of shadowy effect, so it looks three-dimensional. Do it the same each side, and then attach a pin to it. Get a friend to hold it some distance away from you like that. Close one eye or look through a hole in a piece of cardboard and get your friend to rotate it, and you'll find that very same illusion. You know why it works with all of us? Because we're so used to seeing windows which are rectangular. If the same illusion is taken to a tribe in the middle of Africa where they haven't seen rectangular windows, it doesn't work for them. They see it rotating around and around and around, whereas we see it going backwards and forwards all the time.
Well, that's just one example, but because the fellow, I assume that's an Aussie accent. I thought it would be
Yeah, that used to be called that was the Curiosity Show. That was an after-school show on telly.
Yeah, but it really is one of the great ones, just because, you know, just knowing about the way these things work, we still can't do anything about it. Well, I mean, Chris just said it would get the same effect with LSD, but I mean, not surprisingly, there is a connection. And folks who are interested in these kind of things, again, especially going back to the mid-20th century, one of the most famous ones, Aldous Huxley, was a follower of general semantics, and of course he wrote Doors of Perception. That was experimentation with peyote, but you know, a lot of those folks, you know, or there was a contingent of folks out there because, you know, it was the idea of trying to really explore our own consciousness and trying to get past the, you know, our conventional perception and get closer to the reality of things. Right? Because that was, you know, it's something that was lost culturally, because when you look at, like, say, the 60s, you know, and so much of it was about perception, and can we recapture, especially the non-linguistic, the pre-linguistic perception. I think it was Eric Berne, he was the founder of transactional analysis, you know, and he wrote that, you know, a little child looks up and points at a bird, and then the father says, that's that's a blue jay, or it just says that's a bird. And that from that point on, the child no longer sees this unique event. He sees a blue jay or sees a bird, you know, and the idea is to try to get past that. You know, Oppenheimer said that there are children today who could solve some of the problems we have in physics because they see the world in ways I'm no longer able to. So, you know, there was this understanding and this effort to try to get past things and into a sense of pure perception, which is also the interest in Eastern meditation, in Buddhism. A lot of folks found, you know, pointed to sort of parallel ideas in Buddhism or in Zen with some of the elements of general semantics, you know, to try to get at that point. But you know, of course, using some of these you know, psychedelics. Well, I mean, there's a renewed interest in it today, you know, these days, but you know, there are other methods that are perhaps have less physical consequences. That too. But so I do like to bring in, you know, the study of perception and all that we come to understand about sense perception, because that is really an important part of it as well. And it goes to, I know some of you are familiar with the structural differential. You know, obviously that's a whole subject in and of itself, but you know, that idea that, you know, going back to Einstein, we've come to understand that reality, you know, what's out there are events in space-time. You know, again, everything's dynamic, everything's changing. And so to think of everything as an event, as something that's happening, something that comes into existence and is going out of existence, you know, that is what's out there. We can't function on that level you know, constantly. But that idea of the dynamic quality of existence is something that we need to just sort of keep in mind, and especially when when we run into problems, hitches, you know, to bring up, because we transform the world of events into a world of things. Dorothy Lee, anthropologist, she's sadly left out of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And she was more of a linguistic relativist than even Sapir and perhaps even Whorf. She wrote this piece, and she was very significant for McLuhan, for Edmund Carpenter, who worked with McLuhan. But she wrote a piece about word and thing. Of course, in general semantics, we say the word is not the thing. And she wrote that even the thing is a construction, that we don't look at we don't even identify things as things unless we have a word for them. Otherwise, they're just part of the background. You know, they don't come into awareness as objects or as things until we give them names.
We see that in counting, don't we? When you count more than about 3, you've got to use words to describe each increment in the sequence.
Yeah, well, counting becomes an interesting, it's a little off topic, but you know, and certainly you look at, you know, one of the interesting findings is about languages, and especially tribal languages where they don't have words beyond 2 or 3. And then they find that, you know, when you try to do it based on correspondence, they're unable to, you know, which gets at the idea that language is a tool that we use to think with. What's also interesting, just related to that, is the effect of writing, because, and actually the origin of writing, that goes back to Denise Schmant-Besserat, came from, it was accountants who invented writing, and it starts with symbols for numbers. And that when you develop those symbols, you not only get the language for more numbers, but numbers become nouns. That's very interesting, that in oral cultures where they don't have writing, numbers are only adjectives. You can have 3 cows, or 3 seashells, or 3 sticks, 3 persons, but you can't have 3. They don't conceive of 3. But when you create a separate symbol, a separate written character for the number 3, that introduces the idea of 3 as something in and of itself. And that's where you get, you know, 3 as a quantity. And it's like a new way of thinking about things. So that's an effect of writing. But I am trying to, I was getting at, you know, so this is where we get into the idea of abstracting, and, you know, very important point that what's out there are unique events. So even by giving them names, this is so basic, but we each have a name, right? An individual name. Probably most of you there are other people out there with names with the same name as you. As far as I know, no one has my name. But holding that aside, just the fact that you have a name, and you know that, you know, identifies you as an individual, but it also is a kind of abstracting, because it suggests that the you that exists now is the same as the you that's been around for however many years you've been on the planet, which means we ignore the differences. You know, that's sort of Freudian, right? You're the same person you were when you were 5 years old, but you know, it suggests that people don't change, which, you know, some people argue that people never change, but you know, we do change over time.
My daughter was born, we gave her the name, and then she had a Medicare card, and it was like, oh my God, she's a real person.
Yeah, yeah. That's
real Aussie.
That's true, but you know, we also are dynamic processes that are constantly changing, and you know, and yet they're all grouped together under the name. So it really starts with that, but you know, and then even before that, with perception, where we just create a stable sense of what's out there, rather than seeing this sort of like, you know, subatomic particles constantly in motion. We'd go mad, you know. with that. So the idea of abstracting is pulling something out of something else. Comes from science, huh? Well, but it starts with chemistry, to abstract one substance out of another one. But we pull one thing out of another. We remove, we leave behind certain details and only pay attention to generalities. We create generalizations. We put things into categories, and the categories are subjective. Whether Hayakawa has his ladder of abstraction, and he goes from Bessie the cow to cows to livestock, and at each step we leave out details. But that's also a subjective process, how we choose to leave out details, what categories we put things in. So we could just say, rather than Bessie the cow to livestock, which groups her together with, say, chickens, we could say Bessie the cow to mammals, which groups her together with us, among other things. Or we could say Bessie the cow, cows to females.
Quadrupeds.
Yeah, sure. So there are always more than one way to abstract, which brings us to stereotyping. And one of the things when we talk about, I know some of you are interested, how do we get the importance of general semantics across to people? Stereotyping, prejudice. This was one of the great contributions that's forgotten, was that general semantics was part of the basis for education about stereotyping and prejudice, because we understand stereotyping as abstracting, as categorizing, putting things into categories. What's the objection to being stereotyped? One is treat me as an individual, which is bringing things down in level of abstracting, right? Don't treat me as a category, treat me as an individual. The other is that what you're paying, what you're choosing to attribute to our category is subjective. Every group of people has individuals who are lazy, for example, who are unintelligent, who are materialistic. You think about, the kinds of negative attributes or positive ones. Every group of people has individuals who are brilliant, who are generous.
Can dance.
Sure, yeah. And they have people who are musical and people who are not. People who have rhythm and people who don't. And so when we just sort of isolate certain characteristics, we're being subjective about what we pay attention to. So general semantics is very important, has a very important contribution to education about stereotyping. And it also, abstracting is also this concept of intersectionality that's very big now among certain circles, where you say that it's not just about being a woman, or it's not just about being Black, that being a Black woman is different from being a woman or being Black. Right? And that's also something that abstracting speaks to.
What about the mantra, Black Lives Matter? We
Well-
won't get into politics, will we? No.
Well, I do have this, that's a little different, but I do have this criticism, the left or the progressives, which I lean toward. I'm a New York City liberal. There are things that are problematic on that side, especially the further left we go. One of the big concerns and one of the dividing points right now is anti-Semitism on the left. But I will say the left generally is horrible when it comes to language. Terrible. Black Lives Matter, stupid what thing to say. Just say, stop killing us, right? Just stop, excuse my language, but stop fucking killing us is what should be said, right? The same thing was, that came out at that same, or a little bit after it, would defund the police. Idiotic. And African Americans are not sympathetic to that idea anyway. They want policing, just good policing, they want protection. Because, historically, it's in neighborhoods that are kind of, economically, on the downside, that where you get bad policing, where you get a lack of policing. So really bad use of language. A lot of it goes back to Marx and the socialists and communists. They were horrible, and you look at Marxists and their use of language is incredibly alienating. And Gramsci, right? Gramsci comes up and, oh, it's culture, so it's hegemony. Talk to people, blue collar folks about hegemony and their eyes glaze over. No wonder they don't go along with any of this stuff, right? So the messaging has been, largely awful. And, this is one thing that George Lakoff, if you follow him, that comes from metaphor theory, which, I hope to get into, but that is, those are other ways that, they're bad maps for the territory, to put it that way. So actually, since we're on to this, let me first share something then. Let me just get it queued up to, okay. I'll share something that I think is significant. This is a video from Tim O'Reilly. Anyone ever hear of Tim O'Reilly? Sort of curious? No? He was big for folks into digital media and the internet. And you may remember back before, in the earlier days when the internet became popular, and before that, computers, personal computers, but there was O'Reilly Books was one of the major providers of all these books about how to use Microsoft Word and then, how to use the web and all of that. And then then they became O'Reilly Media. Yeah. And so Tim O'Reilly is considered one of the pioneers of the web and what, yes. And before that, open source. So he did a sort of variation on TED Talks called Ignite. It's similar to TED Talks and similar to the Pechakucha or Pechakacha kind of format. That's a presentation format that Americans working in Japan developed, where they give short talks as a kind of entertainment with PowerPoint, where you have 20 slides. They're set to advance every 20 seconds. So you have like 6 minutes, 40 seconds. This is a little different. They're 15-second slides, but this is a PowerPoint video that he does on language as a map. And guess who, when you think about, people in new media who were familiar with general semantics. So he's one of them. And there are others as well. Douglas Engelbart, the GUI, the graphical user interface, that Mac and Windows is based on. He was familiar with Sapir-Whorf and the idea that different ways of representing reality give us different tools to think. And based on that, he developed the graphical user interface with the mouse that was, further developed by others. So they were, again, this is something that people have forgotten about, but that was significant. But let me, okay, remember to share the sound. Okay, I'll share this. Okay.
And we're back. The team is looking down the barrel of a 450.
Sound working?
Ignite is an ongoing series of speedy presentations. They've ranged from building multi-person pogo sticks to hacking chocolate. Any topic, the geeks hold dear. Each speaker gets only 5 minutes, 20 slides that auto advance every 15 seconds. The talk you're about to hear was recorded live at one of the featured Ignite events around the world.
Hi there, I'm founder of O'Reilly Media. We publish computer books, computer conferences, and you guys may be wondering that I'll be talking about tech, but instead I want to talk about the idea that language is a map. It's actually a map that helps us see more deeply the world around us. When I first came to Sebastopol, I saw grass. Now I see alfalfa, oak grass, orchard grass, because I have horses and I have a language for what I see that helps me keep track and understand my perceptions. I first started thinking about this when I was still in high school. I started working with a man named George Simon. He was actually an explorer, scout leader, and he was teaching my brother about nonverbal communication. He later went on to teach at Esalen and places like that. And actually his book, his notebooks was actually my very first book. He was trying to develop a mathematical language for consciousness. He died in an accident in 1973, and I transcribed his notes and published them in a limited edition for people who had worked with him. His work actually began with the ideas of Alfred Korzybski about general semantics. In 1933, Korzybski published a book called Science and Sanity, which is really about this idea of language as a map. And Korzybski famously said, the map is not the territory. That, of course, is also the point of this wonderful painting of Magritte's, where he says, this is not a pipe. It's this idea of the consciousness of abstracting and the levels of abstraction in the world around us and what we use. Now, Korzybski actually built a tool that he called the structural differential, and it was a training device to help us to recognize the process of abstraction. Now, in the structural differential, the actual events that are the events of the real world are represented by a parabola, because those events are actually open-ended and actually infinite. Then our actual perception of those events, our experience, is represented by a circle. That shows that experience is limited, is less than the entire world around us. And what's more, each of us has a unique and distinct experience. None of us are actually sharing the same experience, even of this moment together. But it gets worse, because we actually then attach labels to our experiences. And the problem is we can get lost in those labels. Think about, for example, when somebody gets killed because they're the wrong religion or they're wearing the wrong gang tags, right? This is basically what Korzybski called a semantic reaction. Well, my friend George also tried to integrate ideas from the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo, which is a very different world. This idea that there's a spiritual world that we're bringing into ourselves. George actually defined that parabola as God. God was et cetera, all the rest beyond us. And he also talked a lot about how we could start to bring this experience of the world around us into our identity. So he had the fourth element, he kind of represented as a quadrant system with these 4 elements. It starts with the idea that there's really something out there. You know, we can actually sit and we can realize that the world beyond us is not us, and we can feel the difference. And when we do that, when we allow ourselves to experience the world out, it actually comes into us. It changes how we feel. Right? Our perceptions work this way, but we can also do it in a nonverbal kind of way. And it's only after that, after we let the world in, that we start to recognize our ability to describe that world effectively, to give it labels and structure, and to build a map that talks about our experience and hopefully points back to the underlying reality. And then this last point where George integrated this idea from Aurobindo, that we're actually building a new identity based on those experiences. We literally become the sum of all of our experiences and the stories we've told about them. Now, what's really important is that if you start thinking about how this process of perception works, you start to be able to notice when you're out of track, when you're actually stuck in the labels as opposed to paying attention to the underlying reality. And you can take yourself back up the chain to the experience and maybe just to tune in. And I've actually applied this in my business. So in the late 90s, I was looking at free software, and I realized that we actually had a bad map of what free software meant. The label was wrong. and a lot of the stories that we were telling about it. So I got a group together and we actually told a new story. We started to call it open source software. And that story helped people to see something different about what was happening in the computer industry. We did it again in 2003, 2004, when everybody was convinced that the web was over, the dot-com bust had happened. And we were able to go back and say, no, there's something really important and new happening on the web. We called it Web 2.0. We told a new story, built a new map of the world, and kicked off something as a result. And that is, in the end, how what I learned in the human potential movement of the 1970s has become a foundation of my business today. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, but that way you get like, nobody gets bored if you like, it's like short presentations, but I like to show that, and I do warn the students when I do that, there's a bit of the sort of California stuff. So, I'm a New Yorker, so we have, it gets into some of that, but that's the point I made before, that it got picked up by Esalen and the new agey kind of folks, Alan Watts and all of that, and they see a connection, and and that's fine, but I'm not, I don't endorse that whatever Sri Ali Vinda, whatever that guy's name, that part of it, but it does help to show again the relevance of general semantics for today and for the digital technology that we're dealing with. And it's also a great message because it speaks to what we might call the semantic environment, and really in a sense the kind of metaphors that we use or the way that we represent the world.
I'll just read a comment from Stuart Hill.
Yeah.
Up here. He's floating up on the wall here. Interestingly, all of our folks and resources you mentioned were included in the reading lists of our social ecology students at Uni of Western Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
That's
great.
So it's in contact with the network there, very much so.
Okay. Well, so I was going to do it in a different order, but I think we'll do it this way. I'd like to do 2 exercises. Maybe we'll go a little past 1 if that's, if you're, what I brought paper, but I'll also put it, I'll do the share screen so you folks in the home audience can do it along. And these are both from one of my old professors, Christine Nystrom. Chris was my mentor along with Neil Postman. They were very close colleagues and collaborators, but of course Postman was well known and Chris didn't really publish that much, although I helped with this, but a couple of her students recently published 2 volumes of her work under the title The Genes of Culture. And Chris in particular emphasized meaning and symbolic communication, including general semantics along with symbolic interaction. If you're familiar with that, George Herbert Mead, Irving Goffman, that's that sort of thing, and all. So these are her exercises that I'll pass out, and I'll share the screen. And the first one is on metaphor. So it's linked to Lakoff and Johnson and their idea of metaphor. And it starts with a quote from Dorothy Lee, who I've mentioned. And let me, if you want to just pass these around, and I'll do the share screen now. No, don't. Oh, I have to. Hold off. When is this? No. This one. Oh, okay. Let me do this. Okay. So it starts off with a quote from Dorothy Lee, where she's talking about visual and linear metaphors. So she writes, this is from one of her essays, when we see a line of trees or a circle of stones, we assume the presence of a connecting line which is not actually visible, right? You know, that objects that are in a row, there's no line there, but we, you know, that goes back to Gestalt psychology. And so we also assume it metaphorically when we follow a line of thought, a course of action, or the direction of an argument, when we bridge a gap in the conversation or speak of the span of life or teaching a course or lament our interrupted career. These are all metaphors, but we forget, you know, that they're metaphors. That gets lost. Then she says, we make children's embroidery cards and puzzle cards on this assumption. Our performance tests and even our tests for sanity often assume that the line is present in nature and at most to be discovered or given visual existence. So now Chris wrote up this text, which is this kind of like report from an education, like a schooling report about a student. And the exercise is to identify all of the metaphors embedded here, all of the terms we use, where it's a reference to either vision or the line in, you know, the line in vision, that in these two paragraphs. So I'll ask you to just go ahead and identify them. I can like underline or circle them. I know you folks at home, I mean, you want to jot it down or just read it through and think about it. But you just go ahead. I'll give you 5 minutes for this, and then we'll go over it. And
Dorothy right here is Dorothy talking about Irving or they just Well, she like this thing about the line of trees. Yeah. So I guess where's this other line?
Are we good?
Yep.
Should we?
The second text is a comment that teacher makes about it.
The whole, yeah. Yeah.
Is that Irving relating to? I mean, Irving Lee is a right.
It's, you know what, the name Irving sounds funny to us. And this is a little New York humor there, that, that's all. All right, so, I'll keep the text up for the folks, there, and, I'll just ask, can just call out, what's the first metaphor? Okay, point of view, right? Because we're talking about how we think about things, but we use vision to as the metaphor for that, because it's really not, your position in space. Okay, next. Looks, right? Because we're not talking about a visual appearance again, okay.
And then this notion.
Move on.
Sorry,
The notion of to be successful.
yeah. Did someone saying something online, or?
Yeah, I said move on.
Oh, okay, but successful, actually, succession, the deep, and this is where you get into etymology of words, but yeah, I mean, successful has, it starts out as six things lined up in space, succession, and absolutely move on, right, is not a physical movement.
Higher education is enough further up the ladder.
Yeah, yeah. Or yeah, yeah. And I have to say that before I started kindergarten, and I used to think that first grade would be on the first floor and second grade would be on the second floor. So yeah, I mean, we're not in university, we're not higher up in space, or some might say maybe in other ways, but I don't know. Next.
First place.
First place. I love that, right? That is a fascinating kind of metaphor, like first place, second place. I mean, look at those maps. Where is it on the map, that first place? But yeah, and it actually, this goes back to ancient Greece. I mean, really all of this whole like collection of metaphors starts with the alphabetic culture in ancient Greece, but place is, the idea of places is really very significant, and it has a lot to do with Aristotle. What Korzybski was criticizing about the Aristotelian view has a lot to do with this sort of visual idea of things in their place. So that's very much a part of it. Okay, what were we saying next? Short-sighted, okay. And we use that as a metaphor. What's next?
Reflect.
Okay, but we missed one. It's not an obvious one though, but
Are you going best for
to be best for him.
well, that not best, because that's, it's grades. Grades, gradation, grades are steps. Okay. But obviously, and certainly reflect very clearly, perceive, sure. Immediate, right? Not mediated, and immediate is close in space. Okay.
Advance.
I'm sorry. What? Okay. Some folks bring up sacrificed, which is actually a different metaphor. It's not in the visual, family, but yeah, advance, right? Again, it's this sort of like movement through space. Yeah, second place, yeah.
Then we get to image of himself.
Image of himself. Well, it's just interesting how, again, image, imagination, they're all it's going back to vision. And what's next? Distorted. Okay. Sees himself. Okay. Next.
Back show.
Okay, well, show. And studying perhaps also. What else? Clear. Okay. Yeah. Keep up. Okay. Yeah. Overlooks. Limitations. Focus. Right. Focus all up. Okay. Okay. Attention could be possibly, but certainly poor showing. Oh yeah, we missed that. Limitations. Okay. Okay. One before that though.
Left back.
Left back, yeah. Isn't that a horrible thing? I mean, I remember when I was little, there's this being left back. It's like your parents move away and they don't tell you where they're going, being left back. Yeah. You mentioned step. Okay. What else? I'm sorry. Okay. Force. It's a little different metaphor, but.
Force goes in a particular direction.
Okay. Okay. Well, and examine, re-examine, position, places, channel. Channel is a very linear one. Directions. Even some, there are things like, and it's in Dorothy Lee's quote, but career, which is, and I don't know if you guys do it. I mean, we don't do it in American English, but the Brits do, like careering, like as a verb. It's very unfamiliar to us, but that idea of running full tilt, straight ahead. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So all of these, and as I mentioned, I mean, again, it's a little media ecology connected to it, but they are rooted in ancient Greece, and they come out of the alphabetic culture where the visual metaphor becomes very powerful. And this goes back to the word topic, because if you look at the Greek word that it comes from topos, it means place, like topography, topology, topiary, they're all about place. And so the idea of topic, my theory about it is that it starts with, if you think about putting things into categories with writing, then you write it down and then you list them under that heading. And then you make another topic in a different space on the page and put things under that heading. Yeah, well, the mind map becomes more complicated, but just simply the idea of making lists under different topics, it's a product of writing. And that's where Aristotle's logic, this is my theory about Aristotelian logic, it originates in a very practical way. That if you are doing like an inventory and you want to have different, break it down into different topics, different categories, you don't put the same thing in two different categories, because then it looks like you have two of them when you only have one. And if you're the person doing the inventory for the king and it looks like there's more than there is, and you know, you could get your head chopped off, you know, for that. So that's where like you know, the idea of law of excluded middle and non-contradiction, they're very practical guidelines for how to categorize things. And what was Aristotle but a great taxonomer, right? He was trying to just come up with categories for things, but yeah, exactly. Which is, and that's where Korzybski comes along and says Aristotelian logic is not, you know, is limited. And it's okay for certain things, but it doesn't work for a lot of other things. But, you know, and I think, you know, if we think of it that he was just trying to come up with rules for accountants, then it makes perfect sense.
So each topic has a certain space, which doesn't overlap
Yeah.
the others.
Yeah.
Stuart Hill, our friend, says the text, in quotes, makes me a bit nervous to say or write anything. Well, I felt that way to start, but once David started mentioning, picking out the obvious metaphors,
Yeah.
I got the gist of it.
Yeah. Well, it does show how powerful the visual metaphors are. And I mean, it's actually a real challenge to use something other than a visual metaphor to talk about thinking or anything related to thought. I mean, there are alternatives. I grasp something, right? It's just sort of like this intimate knowledge, which is where like Heinlein, out of that grasp, he came up with the word grok. If, you know, some of folks may remember it, it was popular in the 60s. It came from a science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, and it's about knowing something deeply and fully. But also like the idea of dissonance, right? And consonance is those are acoustic metaphors.
There are other bodily metaphors like it feels right to me, or that's a hot topic.
Yeah, yeah, those are it, but it's just there. So many of our metaphors are so visual in their orientation. So even theory and idea are idea is the same root as video. So I mean, we're still like, you know, we're still like sort of ruled by those. So I find it an interesting challenge to try to come up with that. Tony Schwartz, not the ghostwriter, but he was a media producer. He was associated with McLuhan, and he came up with the idea of resonance. And so like, you know, the idea is like tuning forks where you hit one and another one set to the same kind of field will start to vibrate. And that was his idea for getting that you can't get information across to somebody by trying to put it into their head, but you can bring out something they already know, making it resonate. And so he did advertising, and he kind of emphasized the idea of not trying to come up with a unique message, but trying to get folks to identify with your message.
It makes it rather sort of embarrassing, isn't it, to try and teach language to a non-English, in our case, non-English speaker. They say, yeah, well, how all metaphors, you know, advanced means something quite different in a different context.
Yeah.
But you simply have to learn that that's what it means.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a natural connection.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's helpful to learn to point to the metaphor. And it's sort of interesting then when you get to translation, because we translate terms, but the metaphor might be quite different. They might have like a kind of equivalent denotative meaning, but there's a shade that's missing because the metaphor, underlying metaphor is different. So it is something to be, you know, certainly to be aware of. And this is where we do talk about a semantic environment, because we live in a environment that is conditioned in a way by the metaphors that we use.
What about narrative? Like that's another way of structuring.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely. Narrative. Chris is asking about narrative, and that brings in a different set of structures. You know, general semantics has largely been focused on propositional knowledge and expository writing and representing facts. Narrative stories provide a different way of organizing knowledge that certainly needs to be taken into account. And this is where I talk about the need to kind of expand and make connections to other areas as we're doing it. For Korzybski, he did say about poetry, because he was married to a painter, so he was aware of art. It wasn't just science and this sort of like this kind of representation, but he said poetry can reveal things about the world that other things cannot. Yeah, so all of these different kinds of representation gives us a different map for the territory, a different way of understanding that. And to talk about narrative, and I do go into it a little bit when I do the course, but I have to draw on other sources like Vladimir Prop. He talks about the structure of narrative. So, for example, if you have a story with two narrative elements to start out with, one is the hero leaving home, and the other is something bad happens to the home. Depending on the order you put them in, you get a different narrative. The hero leaves home, something bad happens to the home. The hero has a kind of guilt. But the other one is something bad happens to the home, then the hero leaves home, then that is motivation, right? So, but that's a different way of approaching things, yeah.
Comment from Stu up here says, enabling bracket read personal interests versus showing bracket what I want to show.
I'm not sure. Stuart, do you want to try to expand on that?
Yeah, like as a teacher in social ecology, we tried to enable students to identify what they were interested in, and our role as teachers was to enable them to take the next relevant step in their journey towards achieving what they wanted to achieve. And one of my main experiences of this was a thing in England called the Peckham experiment, which is the largest experiment on health ever conducted, which I'm yet to find a medical person who's familiar with. And they found children were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do over 15 years, and there were 600 families using this facility. Children they could come into this facility and they just scanned the possibilities, and then they went over to the thing that most interested them. And what they found was that they would do that single thing obsessively until they achieved what they wanted to achieve. So if it was diving off the high board in the swimming pool, they'd do that every single day. And then one day they would stop, and then they'd look around, and then they'd be diving over the long box in the gym the next day. So their finding was that sort of learning was in complete contrast to the conventional system of the curriculum, even like what you're talking about. You're saying this is what you do with your students, but that's still your curriculum for them, not their curriculum for them. And I think we can learn a lot from the Peckham experiment. And just incidentally, over 20 years or whatever it was, there wasn't a single case of bullying between children. Children never chose to play competitive games. There wasn't a single marriage breakdown, and there wasn't a single accident in this building, although people were roller skating on the roof and climbing up the bars in the gymnasium, and nobody ever fell off. Because they were choosing to do what they wanted to do when they were aware they were capable of doing it.
Okay,
There you go.
interesting. Well, that I'm not sure what to say to that, but I don't really deal with children myself, you know, aside from having had a couple, but I'll just thank you for that comment, and
That's
yeah,
the Beckham experiment.
is it Bend It Like Beckham, or you know,
Is that right, Stuart? Beckham, is it the experiment?
No, Peckham.
oh,
Pick with a
Peckham.
P. Yeah, right.
Oh, so it's not about soccer,
I'm just curious.
or what you guys say football. I'm sorry.
No, we say so.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Something of what
Yeah.
you're referring to is the readiness principle in teaching, where a person will go on to the next thing when they're capable of doing that, and when there's a structure that enables them to do that. So that sort of dovetails in with how the kids empower themselves too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, couple of presentations at the Media Ecologies Association's conference last week. The folks brought up Paulo Freire, who had that kind of philosophy of trying to bring things out and having a not having a hierarchical relationship in education as a kind of liberation, which you know, is interesting because it looks at the structure rather than the content of education. What's that? Oh, I've heard. I don't. I don't have direct connection, but I remember a fellow, that's social ecology, right? Yes, I remember a fellow giving a presentation about him.
Murray Bookchin.
Yeah.
No, I've met him once.
Oh, oh, cool.
Tom
Yeah,
Val-
Chris is saying he met Murray Bookchin, and I
Tom Valkanis is saying where Del Boy lives. I don't know what the context of that comment is. Where Del Boy lives.
Okay, so there's no Only Fools and Horses fans in the room tonight. Pauline, yeah, cool, awesome.
okay. Well, I mean, anyway, I mean, you know, there's sort of there certainly are various philosophies about education, and there is indeed a tension between you know, how student-centered to be, and you know, Neil Postman was kind of famously made a switch from teaching as a subversive activity to teaching as a conserving activity. And you know, yeah, that's really, it's not an either or. Yeah, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But I do want to do one other exercise with you folks, and you know, as I said, you know, I'm kind of like jumping between things, but what we've been talking about, what we were just talking about, where general semantics is particularly relevant for assessment, you know, evaluation of reality, if you like, and propositional content as opposed to narrative content. Sometimes I think there's also a general semantics personality type in the sense that, well, I mean, that's where other folks have come in to try to fill in some of these gaps. I mean, Gregory Bateson, who really was very significant and very much following in the general semantics line, but brings in the relational aspect. So that, you know, talking about how we relate to each other, where general semantics is largely about how we evaluate situations or evaluate reality. But one of the, you know, one of the really interesting points that came up, you know, that I brought up, you know, early on is about facts. You know, what is a fact? And of course, words always have more than one meaning, but that the idea that a fact is not something out there, it's a use of language. And so a fact is a statement that we make. So you could say, if you want, you could say it's a statement of fact, or a descriptive statement, a statement we make about the world. And that's why people often mistake, or at least, from this point of view, you can have false facts. Because the idea is that a fact is a statement that can be proven true or false. And not everything can be proven true or false. So, we distinguish between different kinds of statements. There are statements that are easy to say, like, this is a bottle of water. And if I say, this is a bottle of water, right, that we can use our senses, or we can and see what evidence is available to us and determine whether something is true or false. Right? Whereas statements about what is good or beautiful, or that are in the realm of judgment or opinion, we can talk about criteria that might be used, but ultimately you can't prove something true or false. There are statements that are just definitions. The dog is a four-legged animal that barks is not really true or false. It's a statement of definition, like let X equal 2. It's not true or false. Well, this very, very much so, because logical positivists, Russell, Whitehead, Wittgenstein, they were all about forming statements that can be determined true or false. And there's a tradition in general semantics, particularly about inferences, because when you assume, you make make an ass out of you and me. And that's the statement of inference is the tricky one, because an inference is something that could be proven true or false if you had more information, but it can't be proven true and false in the current situation.
About the concept of abduction.
Well, that one's tricky. Chris is asking about abduction, which is from Peirce.
Yeah.
Gregory Bateson was very big on it, but it's sort of more in line with metaphor in a way. So I want to just not get into that now, and just get into the fact versus inference kind of problem, so that based on the evidence you have, I'll get personal here, right? You can determine whether I'm wearing a shirt or not, right? Right. You can say that is true or that is false. Right. If I say, can you determine, just based on what you have available to you right now, whether I'm wearing an undershirt? That would be an inference, because unless you went over and peeked, you can't determine that true or false, but you could if you had more information. What?
X-ray vision.
Yes, that's true. So we're all clear on the difference between fact and inference.
Yes.
So
I just look in and read a comment again from Stu. Coming back here, he says the Peckham experiment and democratic education, and in enabling students, I was talking about our adult students in social ecology bracket, partly based on Murray Bookchin. So I'll add this history of comments into our record of today's meeting here.
Okay.
You'll see it in the chat history there, if you refresh that.
All right.
You have to do it on your computer.
Scroll it down.
Yeah, in order to see it on the screen.
Okay, but what I want to do now is an exercise in fact inference distinctions. And some of you, longtime general semantics folks may know them. There was Haney had a series of them, so you may have done them before. But this is another one exercise that Christine Nystrom devised. This will take a little bit of time. It's one of these tests where you read a paragraph and then answer questions about it. But instead of just true and false, there's a third category, inference, meaning that you cannot determine whether it's true or false based on the information. Now, this, rather than sort of sensory experience, this is about the text itself. So this is about reading the text and whether the text is telling you whether something, or you cannot be sure if it's true or false based on the text. So I'll ask you to do this, and let me now share. Okay, so put it up on the screen. I'll just, I'm gonna, there we go. So I put it on the screen for them. So, so can, well,
Yeah, true, false, or
right. So,
Determine.
the one inference that you're asked to make, the one thing that this is based on, is that everything in the story is true. Okay, that's the starting point. So, because sometimes I've had students take the test and say everything's an inference because we don't know that anything in the story is true. And of course, the story is completely made up. So none of it is true in the real world, but the true, false, or inference based on what's in the story. So the idea is to read the story, and of course, grammatical conventions of English hold. So you read the story and answer true if it's true according to the information presented in the story, false if it's false according to the information presented in the story, and the question mark, it's an inference if it may be true or it may be false, but based on what's in the story, you cannot determine one way or another. And so is that clear enough? Can you all see the text? It's too small? Let me, is that better?
A little bit.
Because if I make it bigger, I think we'll lose too much. Yeah. See, we lose too much. So, yeah, if I do that now, I'm gonna lose the screen. So just go ahead and give you a little time to give you 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll go over it.
It's inferred, the first one.
No cheating.
No, that's a false as well, because he could have been having the surgery. As his first surgery.
well, it's not, you don't know.
I just muted them. So.
Right, I can read it.
How many more minutes have we got?
Couple? You wanna,
Yeah, then.
please? I'll wait for you.
Some of them are a little bit hazy. I mean, even the ones that are.
This is a great exercise. I really is very eye-opening for the students to,
It's fairly familiar part of our process.
Yeah.
AGS activities actually, there are
Yeah.
many such exercises.
yeah.
Obviously, yeah,
This one though is,
quite nuanced and.
yeah,
Bit of some social semiotics that talks about the given and
mhm,
given and
yeah. Yeah, there are parallels with that, but this this is kind of more practically oriented, more concrete. I mean, it doesn't get lost in all this, you know,
It's pretty
signal.
practical, if you work in Gaza, isn't it? Yeah, let's say
No, the signifier, signified, and all, you know, it gets like too much.
yeah. Oh yeah, but not so much Syrian semiotic, but more yeah, but I mean social semiotics does have a huge amount of value.
The semiotics largely has been kind of, you know, very theoretical, and this was, you know, general semantics was devised as something for everybody to, you know, to just improve their ability to understand what the hell is going on in there, you know, and resist things like propaganda
and advertising.
yeah, well, that's propaganda.
It causes a lot of arguments, I'd have to say, in our groups,
Yeah,
which you might say is proper and appropriate.
yeah,
But there are many levels of reasonable assumption involved,
hmm,
and that's what we argue about doing.
sure,
Interpretation of what the words mean.
Indeed, or let's say what the author means by the words.
Yes.
We'd sometimes say yes.
yeah. Well, that's a thing of maybe getting too deeply into it sometimes but I guess we can get started now.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess we can just call out, but you know, number one is Dr. Darekill was a young intern at Blear General Hospital. True, false, or inference?
True.
Okay. Right. So that one is true. And, you know, you look at the text always, and it says Dr. Darekill, comma, young intern at Blear General Hospital. And as the instructions say, the, you know, conventions of English grammar hold. And so when you have the comma there, that indicates that the next passage, you know, applies to Darekill. Okay. Number two, the emergency appendectomy was the first operation Darekill had performed. True, false, or inference?
We don't know.
You said what?
We don't know because we don't actually, although down the bottom it suggests that he was the doctor, but he may have been the patient.
Very good. It is an inference. It doesn't say anywhere that Darekill had performed the operation. It just says it was his first operation. Well, let's think of the possibilities here. Before pulling to your point, if it's his first operation, aside from it being the first one that he performed as an intern, first of the day.
Slightly nervous, so it's not sure.
But he could be assisting, he could be observing. But Pauline is the most incisive here because actually there's nothing in the text to contradict the possibility that he's the patient and not the doctor. Right? This is the brilliance of the way this text is devised.
It's quite appalling, Bernie, to a high level.
Apparently. Okay, well, we're moving on now. So let me, but just, so two is an inference. It would be true if it was his first, if the statement was just the emergency appendectomy was the Derkill's first operation. That would be true. But because it says the first operation he had performed, that's what makes it an inference. It's not false. It's not true. We just don't know. Okay. So number 3, Derkill was slightly nervous about the operation. True, false, or inference? Why?
It says the surgeon was nervous. And if he wasn't the surgeon, then we don't know.
Okay, so there are actually 2 parts to this. What it says is it says it was Derkill's first operation, an emergency appendectomy, and the young surgeon was slightly nervous. So number 1, David was pointing out, we don't know why the young surgeon was nervous. Maybe it was the stock market.
Maybe he's proposed to someone who's got Nazi.
Yeah, maybe it's whether he'll get to his tea time and yeah. So we don't know. The fact that he was slightly nervous about the operation would be an inference, but once again, the even more incisive is Derkill the young surgeon. Now, you can join any 2 statements by the word and they have nothing to do with each other, right? You can say that whatever, koala bears eat eucalyptus leaves and Joe Biden is president of the United States, and they have no, and grammatically you can just put 2 things together.
But you could say that there's a strong
Absolutely. This is all about strong inferences that are trying to sucker you into thinking that they're facts, right? Why do we think that the young surgeon is Derkill?
No, it says it's a young intern. Does that mean surgeon?
He was in surgery, but it doesn't say he was doing the surgery.
Yeah, but and that's the point, right? He's the young intern. Is the young intern the same thing as a young surgeon? Right? Yeah, we make the inference because of the word young here connects the 2, but there's nothing saying that they're the same person. Okay, so let's get to number 4 then. Perspiration dampened Derkill's gown and beaded his brow. True, false, or inference?
We don't know because it doesn't say whether it was actually perspiration making his gown wet. We're assuming that.
It's 2 independent events.
Right, it does say that.
Yes. It says Derkill's gown clung damply to his body and his brow was beaded with perspiration. Exactly. So if it were perspiration beaded his brow, that is true. But when the statement has something true and something that's an inference, the statement's an inference. So we don't know what dampened Derkill's gown. What could have made his gown damp? Blood?
Could be that he spilled his coffee on him.
Coffee, water?
The spraying of keeping cool.
Yeah. Or he had an accident because he was nervous, right?
That clumsy nurse.
Yeah.
Junior mint.
Yeah. Or very Seinfeldian of you. Or was his gown damp?
Well, no, we don't know. It clung damply to his body.
Yes,
damply.
Exactly.
Damply is an adverb, and it doesn't really, and it could suggest actual liquid, but it could suggest in the manner of liquid.
Exactly, like some plastics sort of cling damply, right? So all of that's an inference. Okay, so number 5, the head surgeon was a man named Dr. Golupsi. Now, I want to just see who put true for that.
I did.
Pauline. And if, you know, I always
Golupsi.
say this, it's always amazing when I do it in class because some of the women put true. And I say, I say to them, I can
Oh man.
I could understand the guys doing this. Yes, yes. Yes, the head surgeon was named Dr. Golupsi, but we don't know. Could have been a woman.
Shame on me.
Maybe that's just a sign of the times, Pauline. I wouldn't be I wouldn't be so disappointed in that.
Yeah. But it's amazing how often, the women in my classes will, how many of them will put true for that one. Okay, number 6, the instrument nurse flung out her arm for support. True, false, or inference? Okay, nurses can be a man. So what the text says is the instrument nurse standing next to Dr. Derkill flung out an arm for support. So we don't know. And was the arm
male or female? Or
yeah.
his?
So right, the fact that it says an arm, does the arm belong to the instrument nurse? I like to bring that up too, and okay, maybe there's a dismembered limb there hanging around, but more to the point, there are some like apparatuses that are referred to as arm. So we're not quite sure that it's the arm belonging to the instrument nurse even at that point. Okay, number 7, a bolt of lightning knocked out the electrical power in surgery.
We don't know that it
We don't know that
is
for sure.
related.
Okay. So what we do know is that at a critical point in the operation, a crash of thunder shook the room, a huge bolt of lightning split the sky just beyond the window, and the operating theater was plunged into darkness. This is another way that we were asked to make an inference when you have a sequence of events. And of course, the famous saying is correlation does not imply causation. But we see the sequence of events and we make the inference that the earlier one caused the later one. But we don't know that for a fact. So, right. Great way of putting it. So that's an inference. Same thing for number 8, a bolt of lightning knocked out the lights in surgery. How about number 9? The instrument nurse knocked the instrument tray to the floor.
Don't know. There's no evidence to suggest that the instrument nurse did that.
Okay. So again, great. It's a sequence of events. The instrument nurse standing next to Dr. Derkill flung out an arm for support, and the instrument tray crashed to the floor. So yeah, the word "and" connecting two things, the sequence of events, not necessarily meaning causation. And notice again the use of the word instrument on both sides to suggest a connection, imply a connection, but that where there is no connection. Okay. Yeah. Number 10, the patient's terror raised his pulse to 120, far above normal.
We don't know because he might have a naturally high pulse rate and we don't know if it was the terror or the drugs or.
Okay. So we've got, once again, we've got multiple issues here, right? The text reads, the anesthetist reported that the patient's pulse rate was 120, far above normal. So number 1 is we don't know why his pulse was raised to 120, far above normal. And it could have been some other cause. We do know prior to that, the text says the patient was tense with terror, but we don't know that's why his pulse rate went up. It could have been some biological medical reason for it going up. But as you point out, we don't even know that it was raised to 120 because the statement is the patient's pulse rate was 120, far above normal, but that might have been his normal, the patient's normal pulse rate.
For the surgeon, knowing that information.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. We do many things based on inferences, but the question here is it an inference?
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing that you haven't said. Do we know for a fact that the patient's pulse rate was 120 based on what the story says? It's a report of a fact. So on that score itself, it is also an inference, right? By the way, what Chris did in making this was she used techniques often used in journalism, right? That you can write a story, write a report in where the journalist doesn't say something. They just say that this politician said something. And so that is, and as long as that person actually said something, you're quoting the quote, you're using a quote, and you're not responsible for incorrect information. You're just reporting what someone said. Yeah. So, yeah, well, but the thing is that distinction between a report of a statement of a fact and the statement of the fact itself, right? We don't know that the report was accurate or not. So that's always going to be an inference.
Another very strange thing at this point in the story, if I may.
Sure.
The patient was tense with terror, but this is at a critical point in the operation. We know that appendectomies are done under anaesthetic, and there's an anaesthetist there and all that. So this is,
Yeah. Well, there is local anesthetic, so. But you're right. I mean, it is another kind of.
We've got inferences in there.
Yeah.
And we don't have to know that this would normally be under a general anaesthetic. That's irrelevant. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a strange time to be terrified, though, isn't it? If you're unconscious.
That's true. That's true. But let's go on to the number 11. The crash of thunder shook the room at a critical point in the operation.
Yeah.
I put that down as true because they said the same thing, but they just put the order around the other way.
Yeah. So that's true. Because again, I mean, not everything's an inference, right? At a critical point in the operation, a crash of thunder shook the room. So that's true. Number 12, Dr. Golupsi told Derkill to try to control himself, that the operation must continue, and that a surgeon must learn to cope coolly with any emergency. True, false, or inference? You say true?
That's true, and unknown. The operation must continue.
So it's an inference because the last part is an inference, right? That is, right.
It could have been reminded by someone else.
Right. It goes, Golupsi told Derkill to try to control himself, true, and that the operation must continue, true, but then Derkill was also reminded that a surgeon must learn to cope coolly with any emergency. Yes, that's the use of passive voice is another way that we are led to make inferences. And again, this comes from journalism. For example, say, it'll be like, the president said, blah, blah, blah. This reporter was also told that by whom, right? Yeah. So again, part of it's an inference. It's all an inference. Yeah. Okay. 13, the patient died in the operating room.
We don't know that.
I hope not. Here goes my theory.
Right. But it is an inference because there's nothing here that says otherwise. Right. We know that the operation was completed in 15 minutes. The patient was wheeled from the operating room. That sort of leads us to assume the patient's still alive, but it doesn't necessarily says so. Golupsi praises Dirkhill, and this is assuming Dirkhill's the surgeon now, for his speedy recovery of self-control in a situation which any surgeon would find trying. That sounds positive, but it doesn't, the patient could have died, and still it could be, you did great, you didn't do anything wrong. And
No wonder it only took 15 minutes. They killed him in the first 5.
well, it's an emergency appendectomy, but yeah, so again, 13 is actually an inference. 14, the operation removing the patient's spleen included removing the patient's spleen.
Didn't say that. In 15 minutes, spleen and appendectomy. Wow.
Hey,
you guys are fast in America.
snip. Well, but the point would be it's an inference because it doesn't say anything to immediately rule that out, right? You can have like an operation like an appendectomy and see, oh, there's something else wrong, right? So it would be an inference. 15, the emergency generator could provide lighting for 6 hours, according to Dr. Golupsi.
He said 3.
Right. So what would that be?
False.
False. Right. That Dr. Golupsi reminded the surgeon that the hospital's emergency generator could provide lighting for 3 hours, not 6 hours. So again, we've got to throw some of these in to keep you honest. And last one, the assisting surgeon's name was Sam Jaffe.
We don't know.
It's an inference because we don't know. Well, it is in that sense that if it's not, if you cannot determine without a doubt.
But there's nothing in the text that gives us the inference that Sam is the assistant.
Right.
So it's not even an inference.
Well, it's an inference. That statement is an inference in the sense that, if you're confronted by that statement, the text doesn't tell you one way or another. So all you can do is, the statement itself would be an inference that is one that cannot be determined true or false based on what you have available to you.
It's a big deal in running court cases, isn't it?
Yes, and that's where one of the things I say to the students is that, this may seem like very technical and nitpicky, but when you talk about legal cases, that's where this stuff comes in, and it's very significant. I also tell them if any of them are thinking of taking, we have the LSATs or the standardized test for going to law school. There'll be questions of this sort, but also when you're reading contracts, and to some extent you can say, well, the language is misleading, but to a certain point, it's like you got to be able to tell what the language is guaranteeing and what it isn't guaranteeing. So in law, it's very important. In politics and propaganda, it's very important. I also at this point, I also like to note, when you get to someone like Suzanne Langer, if you're familiar with her, who writes, and the difference between propositional discursive symbolic form and presentational symbolic form, like images, there's the idea, images do not make statements, and images are not true or false. You can fake an image, but to show an image, like if I show you an image of, like, we have a window here in this room, and if I say it's raining outside right now, you can look out the window and determine whether that statement is true or false. If I show you a picture of rain, a picture of the window, and it's raining outside, the picture itself is what it is. It's not true or false. It's the same thing. And we talk about propaganda. And I mean, you brought up Gaza, and I really don't want to get into the politics of it, but you think about all of these images that are put forth, but what do they mean? They don't tell you why something's happening or even, the cause of it. And it's quite easy. I use as a neutral example the image of a bombed out building. When any kind of warfare, right? And both sides can use that image. One side can say that the other side bombed a apartment building and killed many civilians. And then the other side can say that our heroic bombers risked their lives to destroy a munitions factory. And both could be true, but exactly. Only the words can be determined true or false, which is why when you go to an art museum and you look at a picture and it's like, well, what is this? So we look at whatever the title is to try to figure out what it's about. But that the image itself doesn't present a claim. It can be used as evidence of a claim, but the image itself doesn't say something. And there have been many instances where it's like they use like the same image of like a wounded person from years ago, and they put it forth. This is, this just happened. Show images of people who are hurt and say, this is what they're doing. But that's the point. It's why images are actually very effective for propaganda purposes, because they don't make this claim, and you can attach all different claims to them.
Because Preston Van Leeuwen, who are social visual semiotics, talk about the way that images, for example, the left and the right, that it's a movement from the given to the new. So there's a way that there's an implicit meaning in the composition of an image, and also that you have the ideal at the top, which is like on the real at the bottom.
Sure. But let me just tell you, Chris, this is not to say that images don't have meaning. And this is very much in Langer's ballpark, that, that there is meaning, but it's an emotional meaning. It's a feeling meaning. And of course, they depict something. That's where, for Korzybski, like an image is a better way to describe something, but they don't make a statement. And that's a distinction, that you can't say this is true or false.
And it's the meaning is not in the photo.
Yeah.
The people's interpretation.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on this, but a colleague of mine was paying attention to the Rodney King trial. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was one of these cases where an African-American man, this was in Los Angeles, was beat up by the police. And they put the police on trial. And the question was, is there excessive force? And the prosecution showed the video that was taken of the beating. And they thought that it could speak for itself. And then the defense took the video and they actually did it like frame by frame. So they asked, well, when did excessive force happen? Because he was resisting arrest, right? So they show the first beating. Was it then? Was it then? Right? And, they were able to add this narrative and show the argument that you can't tell when it becomes excessive force. And where it obviously was, but the thing was that the prosecution thought that you didn't have to say anything, that you didn't have to provide the argument. I don't know if you know Stephen Toulmin, and was from argumentation. He was a philosopher, but he used it was like kind of a modern way to get, how do people make arguments? And it was claim, data, warrant were the three major things. You make a claim, the data is the evidence, but then the warrant is explaining how the evidence supports the claim. And without that, you need language to do that. Edmund Carpenter, the anthropologist who was associate of McLuhan, made a similar point about artwork. And he said, there's no such thing as fake art. There's only a fake attribution. The artwork is what it is, right? Say the fake Picasso, right? It is what it is. It's only when you say this painting was painted by Picasso, that claim, or he uses it to talk about fake native art, that when you say this is genuine native art instead of something produced in a workshop for tourists, right? It's the claim that's fake. The art itself is whatever it is. So again, the idea is true and false only applies to statements formed by language, and within that, only to a narrow band of language statements, which is where the logical positivists said it's all about forming well-formed kind of statements.
Just on this exercise that we did,
Yeah.
you can have great amount of fun if you've got a great amount of time with ChatGPT. Put that in the prompt and then ask questions, and it will make interpretations just like we were doing now.
Yeah.
But it does not do very well. It's got assumptions
Interesting.
and processes and
You can interrogate and say, are you sure?
Yeah. Or is there another way? I won't think of examples, but it's very difficult because of the way our language is made.
Yeah.
To make it amenable to analysis by an AI that's very reliable.
Well,
it's generally at an infantile stage.
Yeah.
In that sort of capacity.
Although I will say that when we talk about intelligence, you know, and we're all educated in this way to make inferences, and we're rewarded for that. All of our standardized tests, for example, you know, it's the one I hated the most, or I shouldn't say hated, but you know, the one where they give you like a little story, a paragraph, and they say, what's the best title for this story? Now, I was great on standardized tests because I knew what they wanted. But I mean, I always had this temptation to get the silly one, because why is that the best title for the story? Right? You know, but that is, we're taught to make inferences. Sherlock Holmes, right? The brilliant detective is all about inferences. By the kind of mud on his shoe, you can tell that he was there. That's not a fact. That's an inference. So we understand that, you know, intelligence is measured by your ability to make inferences. And the point in general that comes from general semantics is, yeah, but we got to be able to tell the difference. We got to know when we're doing it and when we know something as a factual certainty.
So I guess that's where, although it's not clear in the text, you would be making an error in many cases not to make that assumption. Not so much, maybe it's too strong to say you're making an error, but it's within the text. You could say the author's intention may have been.
It can't be.
The author's, but I guess the whole thing is that the author's intention may always be an inference.
Well, we certainly we infer as readers what the intention of the author is, and I mean, so everything we do, or I shouldn't. So much of what we do is based on inference, but that leaves us vulnerable, and that's the point. Is that we can be manipulated by advertisers, propagandists, politicians.
Keenan fella, and he was doing and pretending that only one thing made something else go up.
Sure.
That was all done by some
thing
he wasn't talking about.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing is we can just as easily be deceived by false statements that are presented as fact. So even when something is presented as fact, Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's where we go back to that scientific idea of empiricism, and can we test? Can we check it out? Can we go back to the source, whether it's a text, does the text say this? Or is the statement about the world out there? Can we go and look and see?
But as Brennan Latour would say, that facts are a social construction themselves. So there's certainly
Yeah.
mechanisms by which facts, and he talks about the laboratory
Mhm.
itself and rather than apparatus for creating facts.
Yeah,
So if you claim that there's any fact that is free from the social, from its own social construction, that, yeah.
yeah. Well, I think either this comes to maybe using the word in different ways, or it gets to the point where social construction goes off the rails, so to speak, when you say that there are no facts.
I would say there's no reality out
Yeah.
there. But I would say that every fact is a construction.
Well, if we think of a fact as a statement of description, right? So I'm describing something about the world. And it's a statement that can be tested in some way. Okay. That, yeah. And then there's a second level there of generalization. When we go from pure description to generalizing about things. And that's where that's where I think Karl Popper is very useful when he says you can never prove something true. Now he's talking about a theory or a generalization, a hypothesis, right? That when you can never prove that to be true, but you can falsify, and that science proceeds by falsification. Because to prove something true, you have to, of a generalization, you have to be able to see every instance of it that ever was and ever will be. But it only takes one contradictory moment to prove it false. And so we proceed by eliminating error. Unfortunately, the statement Bruno Latour is no longer alive is a fact.
Sure.
As far, at least it seems to be a fact. And so we can't really question him on this, but
well, Donald Trump told me the other day, triumphantly, as he emerged from the court, he said, this court is a waste of time. It's a disgrace. The police should be busy on the streets of New York.
Yeah.
Because the crime and the danger is all much worse than it's ever been before in history. Of course, the statistics of crime in New York point to quite the opposite way.
Yes.
And he'll say, oh yeah, but there's only statistics, they don't mean anything. It's obvious
Right.
that the crime is worse than ever before, and the police shouldn't be pursuing me. They should be out on the streets solving muggings. There's a real question of fact there, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's where we get into, I mean, again, when we're talking in these big ways, we may not be able to get absolute truth, but scientists refer to the preponderance of evidence. And I go back to me, and I was a smoker back in the day.
Sorry.
And, all the tobacco companies who were denying any connection, and they could point to, well, here's this woman who's like 105 years old and she smokes every day. But when you take all the different angles that they take, right? So, the general statistics, people who smoked are, the greater percentage of people who develop diseases such as lung cancer, emphysema. Then other experiments exposing single cells in the laboratory to smoke, experiments on rats and other, forms of life. And you take all of these different, again, it's the multiple angles, the different maps on the same, pointing to the same territory. And, that's where we say there's, a very strong understanding of this connection. So, yeah.
Well,
oh.
At the end of our booking, perhaps, isn't it?
It's dark.
Maybe it was a clap of lightning that did that.
It could be. Well,
Virgin inference one about a friend of ours who
I could infer that somebody wants us to leave, but I think we've And I think we've certainly gone on longer and we've lost several people along the way.
Well,
So
it's like midnight, isn't it? And
yeah,
8 o'clock plus 4 hours. They should,
yeah,
yeah, close to midnight.
yeah. So
So how's your jet lag?
I'm feel fine.
You don't feel like it's midnight then?
No, I mean, it was very disorienting, but I did some sleeping and yeah.
So when did you actually get into Sydney? I saw your flight got on at 8:30 in Melbourne.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that after. I think we want to, yeah.
Actually, we've still got some worthies online here. Should we perhaps sort of say goodbye to them and wrap it up?
Yeah, that's what
With some degree of gratitude and dignity happening here.
Yeah, I know.
That they stayed with us so long.
Yeah, well, I really thank you all. And I hope we have a chance to meet in person.
Yeah,
and
it's a pity we didn't. There's a multiplicity of circumstances that prevented that happening today.
yeah.
But it's been a great privilege.
And thanks to Chris also for providing the space for us. And again, if there's, please let us know anything that we can do with the Institute to support the Australian Society. And we'd love to see you folks at our events, either virtually or certainly in person.